Yeah. Picture that. Salem. So, other than that, sorry, my inside. Just here. Yeah. I've got Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nathan Getting, Director of the George W. Romney Institute for Law and Public Policy. Thank you for attending today's event. I'd like to especially thank President Dockin, Vice Presidents Mahoney and Milner, and Deans Komandoros and Gordon for the support they've provided the Romney Institute. Today's event wouldn't be possible without it. I'd also like to give a special thanks to former Adrian College student R. Cole Buck, who's here today. In 2017, Mr. Buck created the LGBT and Ally Pride Scholarship with Adrian College, the purpose of which is to recognize Adrian College students who've demonstrated support, advocacy, and leadership for the LGBT community, either on or off Adrian College's campus. If you're interested in applying for this scholarship, I encourage you to contact the college's financial aid office to learn more. Today's speaker has earned many impressive titles throughout his distinguished career in law and legal education. Professor Robert Salem is an accomplished author, attorney, and teacher. He's currently a clinical professor at the University of Toledo College of Law. Professor Salem's presentation is titled, "The Status of LGBTQ Rights, Challenges and Opportunities." He'll begin entertaining questions between 12:25 and 12:30 p.m. So I encourage you to follow up on any thoughts you might find interesting during the first half of today's presentation by raising your hand during the second half. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Salem.
Thanks, Professor Getting, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm gonna just go back and forth to the keyboard because I don't like to be behind a podium. As Professor Getting said, my name is Rob Salem. I'm a clinical professor at the University of Toledo College of Law. The course that I teach is basically a laboratory in the law school. We have, I essentially run a law firm out of my office, and my students, who are usually in their last year of law school, represent real people under my very close supervision. I really hope they never screw up. I have malpractice insurance, and I've been teaching there for 31 years now, and we've never been grieved or sued, so I have an impressive record, and I'm hoping that remains the case. We have a lot of LGBTQ rights in my clinic. Early in my career, we had a grant from the small Toledo Foundation where that allowed us to do this work, and it's grown since then. And so I've had the privilege of really working with the community in Toledo, the LGBTQ community, and we've done a lot of great work in the area of policy as well, getting legislation locally and even working on statewide issues. So that's been gratifying, in addition to representing people in their pursuit of justice. I've also served on the board of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, now called the National LGBTQ Task Force. And I'm currently on the board of the Ohio American Civil Liberties Union. So I do a lot of work in those areas, in this area, in those contexts as well. So this is obviously a topic that I care about a lot. I'm very passionate about. And since I have to speak quickly, because I don't have my phone, so I'm gonna really wrap it up at 12:25 or 12:30 so we can have plenty of time for questions. So I'll be going rather quickly, and I've got a lot to throw at you. And I think it's kind of useful just to possibly, because there's so much material, I am gonna run through it, without much detail, but I hope that through the question and answers, I'll be able to answer some questions that are on your mind. But I'm just going to give you a broad view of the landscape. So first of all, a brief historical perspective. I think it's just important to realize or be a little bit aware of where we were and where we are now. I don't know if I'm talking to people who are really familiar with the LGBTQ movement or not. So if I'm stating the obvious, I apologize. But just a brief historical perspective. We have the LGBTQ rights movement has come a long way, and in a relatively short period of time, unlike a lot of other civil rights movements. And there are a lot of theories for why that's happened. The major theory is that we have, with greater acceptance, with more positive portrayals in pop culture, and more successes in the courts, all those things combined create this sort of confluence of events that allow people to feel safer and more secure coming out. So over the past few decades, record numbers of people have come out as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, and also now other identities like queer, non-binary, and there's a whole spectrum of identities. So because of that, there's been a lot of progress. And because of the fact that so many people across the country know LGBTQ people or have LGBTQ people in their families, and it knows no boundaries, right? So like every family pretty much knows somebody or has somebody in their family who is in this community. Because of that, there's been greater acceptance. Families have had to grapple with it. And over time, we've seen a lot of greater acceptance because people in the community are in our families, and they're our friends, and they're our colleagues. So, a little bit, right now, about 70% of Americans support gay rights in general, according to the Gallup Polling Association, which polls this every year. They've been polling this question for many, many years. And we're at roughly 70% of the American population supporting gay rights, which is an overwhelmingly pretty good majority. And it's been at that level for several years now. We saw a little dip recently because of some negative rhetoric and the politics that happened, that we're all exposed to. But generally, that's where we are. And that rate in 2000, when Gallup polled that same question, was only 35%. In 2000, only 35% of the American public responded that they favor gay rights, compared to 70% today. So this is a movement that is accelerating. I don't see it stopping. We're going to talk about challenges today, but I think overall, it's hard to stop this train from moving forward. And there's going to be a lot of progress, despite some bumps in the road. Support for trans people. Even this is the issue that I think we'll be talking about mostly today, is the rights of transgender people. support for trans people is also, higher than most people think. 44% of the American public say they support the right of people to transition from one gender to another. Not a majority yet, but that percentage is increasing very quickly. About 70% of Americans support the right of transgender people to serve in the armed forces. 70%. And about 62% support the right for minors and other adults to receive gender-affirming care, healthcare, hormone therapy, even surgical procedures. So, again, that's 62%. And might come as a surprise to many because this has been such a polarizing issue. And you've seen so much negative publicity about trans healthcare, especially for minors. But the statistics, the support from the public is higher than most people think, which is a good sign for trans rights activists and advocates and the trans community. And I think it's not going to decrease. Okay, usually we see support from the general public increasing. That's with every civil rights movement, whether we're talking about racial justice, African American civil rights, immigrant rights, women's rights. We rarely see a dip in public support as time goes on. So this is likely to continue to increase in support. Also, let's remember historically, 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. They removed that designation in 1973. So we're not talking about like ancient history when gay people were seen as mentally ill. So again, another example of how we've come a long way. And over the years, as you know, we've had lots of successes in the courts and in legislatures around the country and at the federal level. Most notably is the right to same-sex marriage in 2015 that was decided by the Supreme Court in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. I mispronounced his name when I met him the first time, so I'll get it right someday. So again, we've come a long way. It's rapid advancement. However, there are threats. There are threats, and we're dealing with a lot of opposition right now, and that's what I want to focus on. And I think to make it easy, what I've done is, well, just to back up a little bit, what you're going to hear me talk about a lot throughout all of this are these themes that run through the arguments, the threats to the movement. And right now, what we're seeing is a lot of opposition to transgender existence and rights. And I say existence because there are efforts to erase transgender people from society in a variety of ways, by denying people the right to identify as they wish, by the effort to deny people the right to receive essential care, psychological and medical care, to be who they are authentically. So it's not just a rights movement, it's actually, there's an effort to deny this community's existence. And in addition to that, another theme that runs throughout all of this is religious exemption. So the courts over the last several years have really grappled with these, they shouldn't be competing rights, but they are seen largely as competing rights. A right of personal civil rights, personal rights, like the right of LGBTQ people to serve in the armed forces, to adopt children, to marry, versus the rights to free exercise of religion. So these two rights have unfortunately been sort of competing with each other in the jurisprudence. And that's kind of something that I think is another theme that we've seen that's going to continue to be the case. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. And another major theme is because we're always, people, the movement that's opposed to LGBTQ rights has always focused on the best interest of young people, minors. And that seems to be an easy way to sort of gin up support. When you talk about kids, people listen. And so we hear a lot right now, a lot about parental rights, the rights of parents to make sure their daughters are safe in locker rooms, the rights of parents to make sure that their child isn't influenced to go get surgical transitional care. Those kinds of arguments are being made in the public sphere. And so you're hearing a lot more about parental rights. So those are the three themes that I think are really prominent in these arguments. So what I'm going to focus on are the main areas where I see the threats coming from right now. And I'll end with a little bit of opportunities. And just so I remember, because I don't have this in front of me, we're going to talk about healthcare, education and youth, discrimination and violence, and relationship recognition. Okay, so let's start with healthcare. There have always been a lot of concerns about healthcare for the LGBTQ community. Data going back decades suggests that the LGBTQ community receives lower quality healthcare than the general public for a lot of reasons: stigma, discrimination in the medical fields, the healthcare fields. But right now, you're seeing a real attack on transgender affirming care. Currently, I think 26 states have passed some sort of regulation just recently, relatively recently, to ban or restrict gender affirming care, mostly for minors. I think there's a consensus that you really can't like force adults because of the rights to privacy and pretty well established precedent. You're not gonna see much success in the effort to restrict adults' rights to receive gender affirming or transition care. But the attacks are on the care for minors. So 26 states have passed laws restricting healthcare for minors. In addition, the U.S. Supreme Court just recently heard arguments in the case of U.S. versus Scrimetti. So in December of 2024, the case is about Tennessee's ban. Tennessee enacted a ban on gender affirming care for minors. This case was, we got a favorable decision in the district court level, the trial court level, but the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed. And so the Sixth Circuit said that, yes, states can regulate gender affirming care for minors. It's not a denial of equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And now it's before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard arguments, and we're going to find out probably in June what the Supreme Court has held. Now, if the Supreme Court, which I suspect they will do, holds that states have the right to regulate gender affirming care for minors, it doesn't mean that it's going to be outlawed across the country. It's going to mean that it's going to be left up to the states, just like abortion rights is currently. So we're going to have a real mix of laws, state by state, which is pretty typical in our federalist society and in our structure of government. And that makes things very confusing for people as they cross state lines and people aren't sure what their rights are. But that's going to be a really big development and a really huge question that will be answered for us, at least in part, by the Supreme Court. In addition, I think one of the things that has recently happened that really impacts the rights of healthcare for trans people is the executive order that President Trump enacted day one of his administration, which basically prohibits the promotion of what they call gender ideology. And so going back a little bit, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric and Psychological Association, the American Pediatric Association, the CDC, all are on the same page. So the science and the experts are all on the same page that gender is not binary. People disagree about this, of course, and it's a very controversial issue. But the experts in the field have defined gender as a non-binary, as a spectrum, and the definitions have been that sex is biologically determined at birth. So if somebody is born, they look at genitals, they maybe there's testing that'll indicate some sort of chromosomal issues. They'll look at just visibly what they see and they'll assign sex to the baby. That's the way all of us experience the assignment of our gender or sex. And gender identity is more of the person's inner feelings about who they are. So sex and gender, when you want to think about those terms, is a little bit distinct. Sex is kind of more biological. Gender is more emotional, psychological, and it's just an inner feeling, inner sense of what you are. And of course, the transgender community wants to align their identity with how they present. In many cases, not all transgender people, many trans people just, present as the sex they were assigned, but they feel differently inside their own heads. So, this is still classified as gender dysphoria. It's still something that is treated. It's becoming known. I mean, the experts do not consider it a mental disorder, but it's definitely a condition that soon we'll probably see this change as well, just like we saw the definition of homosexuality change. So the executive order signed by President Trump says, no, that's all BS. We are going to see gender as a binary. There's only male and female. And he directs all federal agencies to operate in a manner which only recognizes male and female genders. So that might affect passports. Right now, trans people and non-binary people can get a passport, a US passport, with an X gender designation. So neither male nor female. That's going to stop. Those kinds of things are going to stop. It's going to affect housing. It's going to affect education, but it's really going to affect how healthcare, or it could affect how healthcare is provided, because hospitals and clinics that are federally funded will presumably not be able to provide gender affirming care if they could risk losing funding. So this is going to have a chilling, at best, it's going to have a chilling effect, but it's still going to be hard to enforce. No one knows how it's going to be enforced. So that's a big question that's up in the air right now. So that's kind of in a nutshell the main threats that I see happening with healthcare. Now, education. Title IX of the Education Amendments Act says that discrimination, sex discrimination in education is illegal. That's the body of law that governs sex discrimination in education. And the executive order that I just mentioned will impact how Title IX is interpreted. Because currently, under the law, under the guidance of President Biden and before him, President Obama, the guidance was that in school settings, in educational settings, we need to look at discrimination against people who are transgender or gay in the same way that we see sex discrimination against women or men. So sex discrimination definitionally under Title IX has come to include discrimination against LGBTQ people, including transgender people. President Trump withdrew that guidance recently, and with this executive order, will also make it harder for that previous interpretation of Title IX to be implemented. So that's a threat in the education sector. So related to that are a slew of bathroom bills that have been passed by states across the country. So we're seeing more and more states say that trans people or people in general have to use facilities or locker rooms that align with their sex assigned at birth, not their gender identity. So think about that a little bit. Right now, I would venture to guess that a lot of you have seen trans people in the community, but you don't even know they're trans because they present in alignment with their identity. And a lot of trans people pass. Now, so like a trans woman who presents as a woman is going to have to use men's restrooms in these states. Okay, that presents a little bit of a concern for her safety and for the safety of others. So there has been a lot of talk about how you're going to enforce this. What are we going to do? Inspect genitals before using restrooms? That's something that's actually been discussed. So this is actually a scary thing to consider. How are we going to enforce this? Also, a lot of people are androgynous. They might not be trans, but there might be some confusion from a casual observer about whether they're male or female. So this in my opinion, invites a lot of harassment for people who might not look traditionally female or male. And that's already happened. There are many cases where that's happened. The rhetoric is so heated that people are being sort of targeted in bathrooms and locker rooms. So this is, in my opinion, a scary thing. Of course, I'm an advocate, so I'm talking about this stuff. When I talk about threats, in my opinion, these are threats to civil rights. Others of you might disagree, and that's perfectly fine. This was intended initially to be a debate. That would have been fun. But I just, disclaimer, obviously I'm a gay rights activist. So when I talk about this stuff, and when we get to questions, please don't be afraid to challenge me. Okay, this is an academic institution. I want to have a good debate. We also have a slew of states that have been passing don't say gay bills. In the education setting, like Florida and Ohio, prevent education, like mostly in elementary school. They prohibit the instruction of sexual orientation, issues related to gender, and any other hot button issues like abortion. So that's also a trend that we've been seeing. Discrimination and violence in general. So about half the states currently have non-discrimination laws on the books that include sexual orientation and gender identity. About half don't. So the country, and this is very political, red states, blue states. If you look at the map of how people vote, it aligns with the maps of where you see these laws. So blue states generally have non-discrimination laws that are comprehensive. Red states generally don't. And in addition to that, hate crimes. Hate crimes, about half the states have hate crimes that include sexual orientation and gender identity, about half don't. And we're seeing, I think, an effort to, around the country, to really weaken these non-discrimination laws that cover sexual orientation and gender identity. In the hate crime setting, there's only one federal law that protects LGBTQ people, one federal law, and that is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Law. That was passed in 2009. But it's very difficult. Since 2009, only 135 cases have been prosecuted at the federal level. So it's not something that a lot of people have used for protection. It really depends on the states. This is a state issue. And states need to enact these laws and use them to protect their citizens. We haven't seen about half the states do that. And I think it's going to be harder now for states to do that because of the pressure to restrict these rights. I put Title VII down there. Title VII is the part of the Civil Rights Act that governs discrimination under employment. I note this because it's very significant. In 2020, there was a Supreme Court case called Bostock, which basically the Supreme Court under Justice Gorsuch, a very conservative justice, he wrote for the majority. And he said that under Title VII, sex discrimination includes discrimination against transgender people and gay and lesbian people. So if you discriminate in an employment setting against somebody who's gay or trans, that is a violation of Title VII. That is considered sex discrimination. The court broadly defines sex to say basically it's impossible if you're discriminating against somebody, a woman who's in love with another woman, that's inherently sex discrimination because if she was a man, you would not be discriminated against her. So that's the rationale the court used. Inherent in discrimination against LGBTQ people is sex discrimination. So President Trump just basically issued guidance, including in this executive order, that says that interpretation is invalid. And so the guidance from the federal government now is to ignore that definition of sex and to revert to the binary definition. So there's an effort to gut Title VII or the Bostock decision. Okay, now whether that'll happen effectively, who knows? We're going to see as these questions continue to percolate through the courts. Finally, relationship recognition. Okay, I've got 3 minutes. Relationship recognition. There's a lot of angst in the LGBTQ community that because of the current political environment, marriage rights will be taken away. And childcare and parentage rights will be taken away. And I don't want to discount those views. I think it's really important to validate those fears. I've been doing a lot of workshops with organizations to try to alleviate their fears a little bit. So the precedent is pretty clear. When Obergefell was decided to legalize same-sex marriage in 2015, it caused a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, probably millions, are married, same-sex couples. It would be very, very difficult to invalidate those. In fact, I would say, it would cause chaos. And I think even our current Supreme Court would agree. Even Justice Roberts, who ruled against Obergefell when it was decided, just the Chief Justice, has since supported Obergefell in his decisions when marriage rights come up. So he has affirmed the precedent. So it's unlikely that the Supreme Court's going to invalidate marriage equality or proscribe it in the future, prospectively. It's really unlikely. There are two justices on the Supreme Court that have indicated they would be willing to do that. Justices Alito and Thomas. But the other justices are not likely to go along with that. So now you never know. There might be more Supreme Court vacancies, and President Trump could appoint people like Alito and Thomas. So I will never say that there's no chance, but it's not. I think the fears are exaggerated. Now, where it becomes a little bit more complicated is with childcare. So a lot of people a lot of same-sex couples are raising children, and they've had children through a variety of means: artificial insemination, assisted fertility, IVF, adoption, children from previous marriages to opposite-sex couples. There are a lot of ways that children are being raised by same-sex couples. I have represented a lot of people who are very nervous about their rights being taken away. For instance, I had clients recently, a lesbian couple who used artificial insemination supervised by a physician to have 2 children. One of them was the biological mother. She's the one that carried the baby. Actually, no. One of them was the genetic mother. She was the one that donated her eggs. And the embryos were created in a lab. And the other woman, the wife, implanted the embryo and carried the baby. So one of the women was genetically related to the children. The other woman was not, but she carried and delivered the children. We made sure the only way to preserve the woman's rights that carried the children to term, the only way to protect her rights was to have her adopt. So we did an adoption. So it's kind of weird. She's the one that gave birth to these children, but to preserve her rights, to make sure they weren't taken away by unfriendly legislation, we have to make sure that she adopted. And that's what people are doing all over the country right now. So that's kind of where we are right now to preserve rights. And there's a lot more I could say about this, of course, but it is very complicated. Now, going forward, I will say that I don't think that LGBTQ rights are going to, I don't think we're going to see an erosion. I think we're going to see bumps in the road. We'll have bumps in the road. This current administration, whether you're in favor of this administration or not, I think everybody can agree that LGBTQ rights will be attacked under this administration. So we're going to see a bump in the road there. But here's a reason why I'm optimistic as an activist, that we're not going to really go backwards. Currently, according to Gallup, 7.6% of the American public identifies as LGBTQ, 7.6%. Now that's greater than a lot of ethnic minority groups. This is a big population. I mean, I think the Jewish American population is like 2%. So this is 7.6% of the American population. So it gives you an idea of, the size of this population. That's not the important thing. Now, when you break that down, Gen Z people born between 1997 and 2012, that might include some of you in this audience, 22.3% of this population identifies as LGBTQ. Okay, we're approaching a quarter of this population identifies as LGBTQ. When you get older, to the older generations, millennials, those born between 1981 and 1996, 10% identify as LGBTQ. And then with Gen Xers, 4.5%, with Boomers, 2.3%, with the silent generation, those born before 1945, only 1%. So you can see the trends, okay? The younger you are, the more likely you are to identify as LGBTQ. This is not going to change. This has been a trend for decades. So for that reason, there's going to be pressure, there's going to be a continued movement to advance rights just because of the demographics. Okay, in 100 years, it's possible that 25% of our population will identify as something other than heterosexual. Okay. In addition to that, there's already lots of litigation. The ACLU is at the ready to fight every step of the way. The courts have always been sort of the last guard. Hopefully that's going to continue to be the case. So that's a very quick summary. 12:33, I'm a little late, sorry. That was a very, very quick summary of what I see as the challenges, but also a few of the opportunities that that this movement is faced with. Please, any questions? I'd love to have further conversation. Yes.
I imagine there have been an intersection between the litigious aspect and like the medical board review side of like
A medical view?
yeah, like the board reviews. Like my question is there what relationship, if any, is there between like the litigious advocacy aspect of advocating for other people's rights and like getting homosexuality delisted from DSM by?
What is the relationship?
Yeah, like
Yeah. Well, so homosexuality has already been removed from the DSM list as a mental disorder. So that happened in 1973. But I think that happened because of political pressure, not because of litigation necessarily. So your question is a very good one. I think that with a lot of the victories in the LGBTQ movement, they've been secured because of litigation, because of court orders. Most of them, I would say, like Lawrence v. Texas, which finally said that sodomy, same-sex relationships, which is still called sodomy, those sexual relationships are not illegal. Lawrence v. Texas was the Supreme Court ruling that said, no, we can't criminalize private same-sex sexual behavior. That was won in court, just like a lot of our other victories. So I would say that litigation informs policy and informs attitudes even in the medical community and vice versa. So the medical and scientific community have also informed public attitudes and the attitudes of the courts. So it's a real symbiotic relationship. And I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but it's really important. So activists in this movement have, for a long time, they've been brilliant because they've used every tool at their disposal to try to secure rights. And it's been, I think it's been the consensus that the courts are the friendliest venue for us. So that's why there's been a lot of litigation. Because, in our structure of government, we're really, it depends on which state you live in. So, you might drive down to Alabama let's say hypothetically, somebody might drive from Illinois with their same-sex spouse and their children to Iowa, and your rights are different as soon as you cross the border. And you just don't know what could happen if you're in a car accident and you have to go to the hospital. Is your spouse going to be treated as a parent? Is your spouse going to be able to see the children if they're in hospital? So those kinds of things are really stressful for people in the community because there's no uniformity. Good question. Other questions? Yes.
How do you think President Trump President Trump's removal of the United States from the World Health Organization, and also the executive order to have such organizations like the CDC keep information from the American people. How do you think that will affect LGBT rights, maybe this specifically like transgender?
Yeah, very good question. And I didn't have time to cover everything that's a threat. But so many of this administration's actions so far, it's only been like, what, a week or something, have been, what can be seen as harmful to not just LGBTQ people, but women and ethnic minorities and racial minorities. So removing, the U.S. from the World Health Organization, different opinions. In my opinion, I think that, that kind of isolates us from the global health community, the global medical community, and I don't see how that's a good thing. Other people might disagree. And I think that's going to impact negatively people who are vulnerable, most vulnerable in terms of health. Okay, and as far as the CDC, we rely on the CDC for so much. And if you start gutting organizations like the CDC and making them less transparent, I don't see how that's going to help vulnerable communities in a healthcare setting. It's just, we'll see what happens. And a lot of this will be challenged. And there's going to be a lot of pressure. So it's not like a done deal that all this is going to happen. Very good question. Thank you. Yeah, other questions?
I think you maybe need to change your slide from going forward to going back.
Yeah. I can see how you can say that. I do think I'm by nature an optimist when it comes to civil rights movements. When you take a historical perspective, civil rights movements, have bumps in the road, but the arc of justice is long, and you generally, when you look at the most prominent movements in our country, civil rights for African Americans, women's rights, even gay rights, even though there are challenges and bumps in the road, over time there's advancement, and I hope that's the case. But I think the next 4 years at least are going to be, we might want to say, going forward, but maybe back a little bit, then going forward again and back a little bit. But yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned how quickly LGBT rights have advanced over the years. Do you think that might make the laws and statutes we have in place more fragile because they're less developed?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. Very good point. I mean, the longer that, the more solid the precedent is, the better, the more secure your rights are. So, when you look at, the right to interracial marriage, Loving versus Virginia, when, now it's been decades since the Supreme Court has said that it's okay for white people and black people to marry each other. And there have been numerous court rulings after that have affirmed that right. And so it's hard to imagine a situation where, in modern times, that right could be attacked. It's hard to imagine. And that's partly because it's so well established, it's so old. So I think to your point, Obergefell, that provided rights to same-sex marriage, there's still, as you've seen from certain members of the Supreme Court, there are still some vulnerabilities because it's relatively new. And now with that also, with Obergefell, fortunately, there's also been congressional action. There's legislation that has created a right to same-sex marriage. So it's not just the courts, it's also Congress that has affirmed this. So the more action that we see, there have already been a couple of cases that have sort of on the edges challenged same-sex marriage that have gotten to the Supreme Court, and the court has ruled in favor of same-sex marriage. So the more that happens, the more comfortable we should be that right is secure. But certainly with legislation, And definitely with executive orders, executive orders are just issued by presidents, and the next president can undo them. Doesn't have to go through congressional approval or anything like that. Legislation, of course, can be also reversed, stricken through either acts of a court, a high court, if they're found to be unconstitutional, or by the legislature repealing and amending. So, that's also possible, and we could see that happening in state houses around the country that have already enacted civil rights protections for LGBTQ people. Although I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of that. I think that we're so polarized, the geography, and we're sort of self-selecting. I mean, it's really fascinating to see the migrations, even in the past 8 years, 10 years, people are moving to jurisdictions that more align with their values. And so we're going to become increasingly polarized as a country. And we're really going to have bright red states and bright blue states. And so those bright blue states are not likely to budge on civil rights, and the bright red states are not likely to budge in their position. I mean, we're going to see more of that. Yes.
So I have two things. The first is kind of response to the last thing, and the other is a second question. But I mean, wouldn't you say that the overturning of Roe versus Wade basically teaches us that in this moment, long-standing precedent really doesn't mean necessarily that much? And the other question I have is that it's my understanding that right now, trans people who have put in applications through the passport to have their gender corrected, that's been kind of, the agencies have put that on hold, installed that. And so I'm curious whether you think there's any viable legal options should it stay in that sort of frozen state.
Yeah, so the first point about Roe v. Wade. So I think you're right. I mean, the Supreme Court, courts could always reverse themselves, even with very established precedent. I think with abortion rights and reproductive rights, it's kind of a unique issue. It's kind of a thing that has for so long polarized the public that it kind of stands alone because there's been so much political pressure and so much strategic, so many strategic efforts to undermine Roe v. Wade. So it is sort of unique. But to your point, is it possible that Obergefell, that the Supreme Court might reverse itself and say Obergefell is no longer the law of the land? Yes. I do think the difference is, and this is more sociological, with the abortion rights movement, it was hard to put a face to people who needed reproductive care. So the abortion rights movement was relatively faceless. We couldn't tell stories, and I'm on the board of Planned Parenthood too, so we couldn't tell compelling stories about people who needed reproductive care because most women didn't come out and say, hey, use me as the face of this movement. And so it was relatively faceless, and it was easy to kind of look at this issue in the abstract and focus on the unborn child, which is what a pro-life movement effectively did. And so you saw billboards with fetuses and babies and everything. So they effectively used images that I think were really compelling, whereas the pro-choice side could not. With gay rights, there are faces. Every family can think of faces. Most of us, how many people in this room have family members who are gay or lesbian? That pretty much reflects society. It's going to be hard for us to go backwards because there's going to be so much pressure on the other side to preserve rights. It's going to be devastating. It'll be chaos to just invalidate marriages or to tell people in the future they can't get married, but their forefathers and mothers could. That's clearly a denial of equal protection. So I don't know if that addresses your issues. Now with the marker on the passports, yes, there will be litigation about that. And I'm sure the ACLU is going to take that up, as well as the Transgender Rights Project. But, you know, I'm not sure they have really good legal arguments, given, you know, that we don't have a lot of precedent. There's not like an established right to identify as non-binary that, you know, at the federal level that we can. So that's going to be a little harder. I think that the pressure is going to be political, and also there are stories to be told there, because if you're a trans person who presents, let's say, male, and you have a beard and you're balding, and you got hair on your chest that's visible, and you go to the TSA agent and you present a passport that says you're female, that's going to cause some issues, okay? And that's going to cause there are arguments that this might impact people's right to movement, their right to association. You know, there's all kinds of rights that could be infringed by not allowing people to identify as they present. Okay, so we'll see some. Yes.
I'm a psychologist, so I'm looking at this from a different perspective, and right now, I'm a preventionist. Could you leave with Nathan a list of organizations or places or contacts that might be helpful for people who are looking for that now?
Absolutely. That's a great point. So I'm not familiar with Michigan as much as I am Ohio, but I will find a good list of resources and forward that to Nathan. And yeah, that's really important. And I will say that, I mean, my phone is off the hook, right? You know, with people calling, freaking out about like what their rights are gonna look like right now. So I've been doing workshops and, you know, just trying to help as many people as possible. But, you know, especially people that are not familiar with law and jurisprudence, there's like rightfully a lot of anxiety because they think, a lot of people think that with just a stroke of a pen, their rights are going to be taken away. It's a lot harder than that. What I think is more concerning, which I didn't really address, is that the rhetoric is creating, hate crimes have spiked. Hate crimes, according to the FBI, have spiked dramatically against LGBTQ people. Roughly a quarter right now of all hate crimes reported from 2023 are motivated by animus against LGBTQ people. And that's been increasing the last several years. In addition to,
Me, Professor Salem, I hate to do
You hate
this.
to- okay.
Students and faculty, we're already over, and students and faculty have class at 1. This should have been 2 hours. That's my error. And before I say goodbye to everyone, I'd like to correct a couple of other errors. I see that Jeffrey Mason, a Buck Scholarship recipient, is here, and I should have recognized him in my introduction. Thanks for attending, Jeffrey. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Michael Sorrentino, a Romney Institute intern, for helping set up today's event. I really do apologize for cutting you short. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Students, get to class on time.
that was very important.
Thank you very much.
Very much appreciated. I intend to, yeah, man, I'm going to.
All right, it's
As long as I make it from here. Thank you very much. When you go to mention, you have the seats. So. What's the phrase? Would like to get them like, kind of keeps some stuff back.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not forward to back, where it's just side to side.
Yeah, bump here, all that. So yeah,
Thank you, so.
Yeah. Next time.
queer community. Thank you so much for representing and showing. Michigan, Ann Arbor, educator specific to the queer community. So appreciate it. How are you?
Can I get your?
Didn't get the opportunity of. Oh.
You know, person. Yeah. Oh.
Sure. Yeah. Just in case. Sometimes I get like we should do.
Essentially, about some of the that's how he's disclosed to considerations. And I know Michigan has but what is the process that actually is the game?
Well, and,
The attendance. That's a violation of these. So they're going to test like that spot. That's not to say that.
Sorry, but their flags come.
Yeah. Clinical center. So that's. Thank you. I will. Okay.
Yeah.
You want to do it? How are you?
You know, everybody.
Last thing you get my.
Yeah, so.
Great show.
Yes, are you teaching?
I'm taught in this room, and I can't say it.
I actually have one.
Board straight, I should. I mean. There were 8 guys.